these buttons. So hi everyone. Like I said, I am Sarah Jackson. I am the Twice Exceptional Instructional Specialist for Montgomery County Public Schools. And I've been in this position for about 7 or 8 years now. I forget after a while. Um, I am also proudly a Twice Exceptional person myself, and I will try and do a lot to contextualize what the world of Twice Exceptional really is as we get through this. I have clearly been Twice Exceptional my whole life, and so um, I have a really interesting, I think, perspective on a really interesting perspective just on being a early diagnosed girl with ADHD, and then also being early identified as gifted and going through a lot of this stuff throughout my whole life. Um, I am very open. I have very little filters. Quite a few people on here that I recognize know. Um, and so I kind of try to bring that all to the forefront as I go through, what does it mean to be twice exceptional? What does it not mean to be twice exceptional? And then how does that impact us as both educators and people? Um, I really love the mix of folks that I have. And so I just kind of want everyone to toss in the chat right now, kind of a why you're here. And I love all answers. So I have had everything from I needed 3 credits and this looked interesting, which I appreciate because that means I did a great job with the job description. I have some of them that are just, you love me so much, you just need to hear me speak for hours upon hours throughout your entire spring semester. I will take any answer, but I would love to know what brought you guys here to our class if you want to put that in the chat. Yes, recertification, best answer. I have learned some of my most interesting things because I was desperate for recertification, and there you go with that. I love the span we have on here. I have people who are pre-K special ed. I have some people here who are teaching in our ELC classes, and I have people here from Northwood, which is where I came from before I got up here. And I love to see all of this. And just so everybody kind of has that sense, and hopefully I'll do a good job explaining this as we go. Um, when I talk about giftedness, twice exceptionality, all of those pieces, um, I like to also help contextualize it because giftedness and twice exceptionality can exist in a lot of different venues. And some of the most interesting pieces I've had over the years have been people who are in some of our classrooms with students who are significantly cognitively impaired. But even within that population, we can contextualize giftedness within a relative population so that they do have students who are more gifted than their peers, and how do they deal with that asynchronicity within their classroom. So I welcome everybody. I hope everybody gains something. And as we go through the class and get into what our project is, I think on the website it says case study. I don't know why I put that in. I was feeling ambitious at the time, but truly what it is it's an opportunity for you to look at a different way, looking at your classroom and take what we are learning here and put it into your real world and your real perspective. And we will get into that later. I also, just get some logistics for my class. We meet every Monday that we have school between now and I want to say April 7th. Please look at the class and the emails. I am horrible with dates and times, but I try and approximate it. What I do know is if we don't have school scheduled for that day, we don't have class scheduled for that night. Why? Because I had way too many times where I was rushing back from doing something with my kid and I was barely making it to class. So I made an executive decision that we don't have class if we don't have school. Class will actually end before spring break, but the work for the class is not due until the end of April. That is my way of building an extended time, both for you to do your work and me to grade your work. I read everything that people write, which means it takes me way too long to grade everything, but keeping up with what we're doing and getting all of it done by the end of April, it's not hard to pass my class because really I cherish them learning a lot more than I appreciate the or force the work to come through. And I love working through and seeing what everybody is producing. Um, if you are in unique circumstances, if things happen, if life happens, please reach out to me. On the home page for our class, there is a office hours with Sarah button. And what that is it's a, excuse me, it's a booking link. So you click on it and whatever time works for you, you book a 30-minute appointment with me. If nothing works for you, reach out to me and we'll find a time. But I really do want to make this work for everybody. One thing I do is I have frequent guest speakers in my class because I genuinely do not want you guys to sit here and listen to me talk every Monday for the next umpteen weeks. Um, when we have so many people out in the field who are amazing in their own right. And one of the things I love to do in my world is make connections with other people who are into Twice Exceptional, into Twice Exceptional. And so we will have some really cool guest speakers over the course of the semester. Um, but going back to that family first thing, one of your guest speakers is coming on a night where I accidentally scheduled something with my child and I forgot I was teaching class that night. So you guys are going to have an amazing guest speaker and I will be at a concert downtown. Um, but again, things happen. You can miss up to 2 classes. You can also make up my classes. I record everything, and I have a YouTube channel that is for MCPS, and I put all of my courses up there, or I'm sorry, all of my lectures up there. So if you do end up missing class, somebody already texted and said that their speaker isn't working and they can't hear me. Just go click the link and watch the class, and I have a little thing for you to do to make up missing it in the first place, just so I can keep track of people being here. And we make it work, and frankly, sometimes I'm also perfectly happy if you pick a guest speaker from a past course and watch them instead, because I've got, like I said, I've gotten some amazing speakers, some highly sought after keynote speakers who are kind enough to come and volunteer their time with us, and they have amazing things to tell you. So I will have a list of all of those guest speakers up on the classroom. That was another example of family happening. I've got something going on in my family. I did not get the class posted the way I wanted to. So that will be up and running hopefully by the end of tomorrow. Um, and you guys will see much more of the stuff. So right now there's like the link for the Zoom and the attendance. I promise it will be better tomorrow. Um, if we don't have any other logistics questions, then I am going to have us go ahead and get started. I think just one more piece is I always have us take a break at about 8 o'clock, usually 5 to 10 minutes, just because 1, my voice hurts, 2, everyone needs to go to the bathroom, and 3, we all deserve a stretch break. But break as you need to, camera on, camera off. As long as one person has a camera on, I'm pretty happy because then I'm not talking to myself. Um, but otherwise, we are gonna take this away. So I tried really hard to be more organized this time around. Usually what happens when I try to be more organized is everything goes sideways, but we're gonna try. Um, and so I want to just go over basically the start of this. What is twice exceptional? Some people are coming in knowing they're twice exceptional, and some people are here because it looked interesting and they don't know what it is. So we're going to take it from the start and talk about what is twice exceptional. Um, and part of what we'll go through over the next week or so, when we talk about what is twice exceptional, we also are going to talk about rights, responsibilities, what it means for our classroom, what it means for our homes, because twice exceptional exists in a lot of different venues. And so I want to make sure that we're really clear on that piece. Oh, this is me trying to be organized. I have objectives. So I'm going to play this, and I'm really going to hope you guys can hear it. If you can't hear, pop off mute and tell me, please.
Point in your career, you have come across this kid. You know, the one who most can't seem to figure out. The quirky but smart one. The great kid who asks higher order thinking questions, yet cannot read at grade level. A difficult child whose emotions take him away, yet he's solving problems in math that no one else in the entire class has even thought of. The kid who struggles with sitting still, showing signs of ADHD, yet can be quiet and create the most amazing, insightful works of art, poetry, or music. The highly creative ones who are disenchanted by the educational system. They claim they hate school, yet can talk with you as an adult, your level, and make you stop. Some of these can read, they can't write, or even solve basic math problems. But you, as a trained and seasoned professional, see more in this child than the below basic student. You see something miraculous, something almost something. Their development is asynchronous, exceedingly high in one area, but tragically low in another. You know they qualify for gain, but something is keeping them separate. They struggle. Are all these kids alike? Is there something you can do? Welcome to the world of twice exceptional.
So, oh, no, move. There we go. I always like that video because it's our entire course in a minute. And to me, I think it does a really good job of framing the questions, the frustrations. What is it that makes Twice Exceptional so interesting and so frustrating, really, for so many people? I'm going to get in a little bit into the nitty gritty now. I want to talk about some definitions of Twice Exceptional. I know I saw it a little bit in the chat, and one of the things that we talk about is, how do we define what is twice exceptionality? And I know when I first started, we actually didn't really use the word twice exceptionality. What we talked about was GTLD, which is gifted and talented with learning disabilities. That is a part of twice exceptional for sure, but it doesn't really encapsulate what is twice exceptionality. Additionally, within MCPS, we officially, hopefully change soon, we officially define twice exceptional as being identified as gifted and also having an IEP or a 504. And while that's not inaccurate, it again doesn't capture, not all twice exceptional kids need to have IEPs or 504s. There are a lot of twice exceptional kids who are in general education because of the way we do gifted identification. Not all of our twice exceptional kids are identified as gifted. So in creating some of these definitions, we create limitations, and sometimes what it is we're doing is limiting in and of itself. So I'm going to go over some really broad definitions, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm hoping, what I'm proposing that we actually do in MCPS. So this is like a sneak peek into what's coming. So one of the definitions I really like is from Scott Barry Kaufman, who is also a twice exceptional individual. Scott has a really amazing story where he actually was denied entry into taking AP classes. Back when he was in school, you actually had to have a certain IQ to be allowed to take AP classes in the district where he lived, and he did not have that IQ score. He had an IEP, he was considered to be cognitively impaired, and he was not allowed to take those courses, even though academically he qualified for them. Eventually, he tried to go to Carnegie Mellon University. He was also unable to get in there for what he wanted, which was psychology. What he actually got in for was opera singing. And he eventually graduated with his degree in psychology from Carnegie Mellon and eventually his doctorate from Yale. And he now works on new theories of intelligence in humanity. Brilliant man. So I really, because of his experience, because of all those pieces, I like the definition he has published back in 2020, where he talks about how twice exceptional individuals have exceptional levels of capacity, competence, commitment, or creativity in one or more domains. So really, that really broad definition that shows that you can have your giftedness anywhere. But it's also coupled with learning difficulties. And again, I appreciate when we say, sometimes it's semantics, sometimes it's not. But because disability is one, not only a loaded word, but also a legal term, we have to remember that all twice exceptional individuals who have these difficulties don't necessarily have a coded disability. So I like that we differentiate with that. Um, they end up with a really unique set of circumstances. And one piece that is very important, and we'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, is this concept of masking, where twice exceptional individuals are often not seen as twice exceptional, but rather one part of their ability or disability is masking the other, so that we full front see one piece of it and we don't actually see the individual for what they are. Because of all of this, these students or people require specialized methods of identification, because traditional methods don't really work well. Um, they require simultaneous instruction and enriched and advanced pieces, while also having those needs met wherever those difficulties are. And they also require academic and social emotional instruction in order to be successful. Another definition that I really like, but this one comes from the Council for Exceptional Children, specifically the Association for the Gifted. And CEC TAG worked with multiple different organizations to come up with this definition, which they refined in 2022. And this is the one that we are tweaking to create our own MCPS definition. So in this one, we talk about kind of that same piece, with the masking, the unique set of circumstances. Um, we also bring in the fact that twice exceptional students also can come from any circumstances, including those that are impacted by socioeconomic, individual, or cultural diversity. And we will talk much more in depth about that in a week or so, and really focus on what is equity in terms of twice exceptionality. We know these students will perform at, above, or below grade level, and grade level doesn't necessarily define what their needs are or where they are at. We require that specialized identification, which, Dr. Kaufman pointed out also. We talk about the enriched educational opportunities, but also the fact that our teachers need to learn different pedagogies and strategies in order to meet these students' needs. We talk about that simultaneous support. One thing they put in here is therapeutic interventions, and I actually spoke with the president of CEC TAG around that word therapeutic, and it's interesting because what they intended when they said that were things like occupational therapy, speech therapy. I pointed out that in the public school system, therapeutic interventions has a very specific meaning, usually around social, emotional, psychological support. I don't know if they're going to change that in a future definition, but it was an interesting conversation to have. But I also really liked this fourth bullet here, where we talk again about the fact that those who work with our twice exceptional kids require specialized training and ongoing professional development in order to be successful in teaching our students. One reason that I am as involved as I am in things like CC TAG and NAGC, which is the National Association for Gifted Children, is because I want to make sure that I am also keeping up with professional learning and development, because we want to be able to know that we're always learning about our children. We're learning about all these different profiles as we learn more about what is neurodiversity and cognitive diversity. We want to be able to address our student needs. And so keeping up with that professional development and learning is a really important part of being a successful twice exceptional teacher. So I'm going to actually have us, I know this is an advertisement for a conference that happened a hot while ago, but I like kind of some of what Matt says. Hopefully Matt's schedule and the stars will align and he will actually come speak to us in a few weeks. Matt does an amazing presentation really talking about cognitive diversity and neurodiversity as a culture in and of itself. And I love the work that he does. But I'm going to have you guys listen to his definition of twice exceptional and kind of where it comes from when he's presenting.
In my first published research article on twice exceptional students, I highlighted the experiences of a young man attending Eton College in 1949. Upon receiving his report card, he found the following comments included from the headmaster. His work has been far from satisfactory. He will not listen, but will insist on doing his work his own way. I believe he has ideas of becoming a scientist. On his present showing, this is quite ridiculous. If he can't learn simple biological facts, he would have no chance of doing the work of a specialist, and it would be a sheer waste of time, both on his part and of those who have to teach him. That young man was Sir John B. Gurdon, winner of the 2012 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his groundbreaking work in the area of stem cell research. Ironically, if young John were in school today, it is possible that, based upon these comments, he would have been more likely referred for testing for special education services, but not assessed for giftedness. When a student presents characteristics of giftedness, evidence of potential for high intelligence, creativity, or leadership abilities, combined with a learning or behavioral difference, they are said to be twice exceptional. It has been estimated there are 385,000 twice exceptional students in our classrooms today, though this number may actually be much greater due to the lack of a systematic identification approach for these students, combined with the tendency for educators to focus on the child's challenges rather than their strengths, and then using this as evidence that the child could not possibly be gifted, a phenomenon known as masking. In addition to academic challenges related to their learning or behavioral differences, these twice exceptional students may also face many social emotional difficulties. Baum and Owen have suggested that disruptive behaviors in class may be an outward sign of these students' feelings of inadequacy and low self-esteem related to their achievement in school when compared with their peers. Further, they can display emotional intensity, suffer from low self-concept and self-esteem, and experience frustration that leads to a general lack of motivation. Although these twice exceptional students may demonstrate varying degrees of difficulty in their academic and social worlds, there is evidence to suggest that students who are gifted or who have above average intelligence with special education needs may have a greater potential for creativity and creative achievement. It is important that educators pay attention to and cultivate that creativity and innovation inherent in these students, rather than to let these qualities remain dormant and underdeveloped. In order to accomplish this, it is important that schools implement a systematic approach to the identification of these students, combined with in-class supports and strategies that highlight their strengths and leverages those strengths to address their challenges. I hope you will join me in this important conversation.
All right, we'll cut Matt off because we're not going to join him in his important conversation because it happened 5 years ago. But I like the perspective that Matt brings.
In my first published.
Yes, thank you, Matt. One concept in Matt's publication that he vaguely referenced there was renaming, the idea of renaming ADHD to ADHG, which would be attention divergent hypergiftedness. And he talks about how, it's not so much that it's a disorder, but because people with ADHD really can hyper-focus when it's important to them, and can display that creativity and that giftedness in very different ways when it's important to them. And that's not to be confused with the idea that, people with ADHD only care about what's important to them, because that's not accurate. It's more that when something draws our attention, we are able to hyper focus on it. When it doesn't draw our attention, or when our attention wanes from it, it is almost physically hard to bring the attention back. I'm a very visual person, and in my head, I literally sometimes, hopefully some of you remember these things, I physically sometimes almost have to step on a oh, and then I just lost the word. The shifter pedal. Wow, it'll come back to me later. But I physically feel like I have to gear shift my brain. And sometimes I'll even take my hand and like move it back and forth like I'm trying to shift like I'm trying to shift what it is I'm thinking about, because I have to like stop my brain from doing something and force it to go somewhere else. And so I think it's really important that people, understand that the same thing is true with our students. Even when a topic is interesting to them or something, when their attention has drifted, it's hard work to bring it back. And even when you're interested in something, it's hard work sometimes, especially when you're listening and not doing. It's hard work and draining of your energy to keep focused on the task. And one thing to remember about our students is well-behaved students behave well in the classroom. Students who are good at school do well at school. Students who are thinkers, students who are more creative, students who have a lot of these different types of gifts, one of their gifts is that they're really bad at school. School is not made for them. And so a lot of things that we see as deficits or struggles is really because the environment isn't the right environment for our students. We also can't fix that. So we have to work within our confines as a public school system, but we also have to be aware that we are forcing a lot of square pegs into round holes. And that's kind of a painful exercise for everybody involved. So, some of what we're going to talk about is how we can make those metaphorical edges, a little wider, maybe make our kids a little less sharp. I don't know what direction I'm going with my metaphor right now. But really, it's kind of recognizing all of those different pieces and then trying to create a world that is better for all of us. So I do want to touch just a little bit on what COMAR, what the Code of Maryland says about giftedness and twice exceptional. Um, it's not the most exciting stuff, but I made a pretty background, so hopefully that works for something. So the first part is, what does COMAR actually say about gifted ed? So in 2019, we actually republished the definition of not only how we identify giftedness. It wasn't a lot of major changes, especially in terms of definition. One thing that we did actually do was reaffirm that gifted and talented students should be found in all groups of people across all cultural, ethnic, economic groups. And then we kind of changed how we do our identification for them, and also reporting requirements was a big thing that changed in 2019. And then what was the, oh yeah, like a pandemic showed up and completely screwed up everybody's ability to report anything. So we have not actually been reporting our numbers on giftedness or gifted identification for the last year or so. At the state level. So we don't have great numbers about that right now. We're hoping that that's going to get cleaned up in the next year or so. But we did actually change the reporting requirements because, as we all know, and if it doesn't get measured and if it doesn't get checked on, it doesn't get done. And so this was actually an important thing to change how we report about giftedness across the state. One other thing that was really big in 2019, and shockingly, is something that is still almost a foreign concept in other states around the country. We have to have a universal screening for students. And what universal screening is it means that you don't recommend students to be screened as gifted. We don't set parameters to say you have to fall within the XYZ box in order to be screened. We screen everybody. There are a couple of caveats to that, but essentially every student who's in second grade is screened, and then students who are not identified as gifted can be screened again in third grade. And then the state law is they must be identified no later than third grade, and then we have to have an additional screening between third grade and fifth grade, and then one in sixth grade through ninth grade. So MCPS specifically, we do second grade, third grade, fifth grade, and seventh grade. Could that change next year? Things can change whenever, but that's what it's been the last year or so, and that's what it is right now. I see you have a question.
I was just wondering, is there a reason that we wait until second grade to start assessing for that?
Um, there's not particularly a good reason. There's not necessarily a bad reason either. Part of it, I think, has to do with the sheer number of kids that we test. We are, as everyone knows, a very large district. Um, Baltimore County or city, sometimes I get them mixed up, start screening in like kindergarten. They also only have about 30,000 students. Initially, when we were doing a lot of our screening, we were testing students, and tests cost money. And it was just a very expensive thing to constantly test different groups of students. And so I know that played a small part in the decision-making process. Also, a piece of it is we don't have formal programming that starts until fourth grade. And so because one of the pieces of COMAR says that students who are identified as gifted have to have something different available to them, it hasn't been available. And um, so that is a piece of it. And then the last piece is how we do our primary talent development. And for MCPS specifically, we do primary talent development instruction, which is teaching some of those softer skills, the creative thinking, the critical thinking, problem solving skills. We specifically teach in our Title I schools in kids in kindergarten through second grade. And part of the idea of that is helping to level the playing field, because we do know that wealth plays a role in a gifted identification, and that often we see a larger population of wealthier students identified as gifted, not necessarily because they're gifted, but because they've had opportunities and exposure that other students haven't. And so part of our process of leveling the playing field is to provide some of that instruction to students in our Title I schools, so that when they are first being screened in second grade, they have had 3 years of talent development instruction to kind of help level the playing field, because the screening that we use, like the COGAT, tests on the aptitude, the critical thinking, some of those again, softer skills that aren't necessarily part of the curriculum. That was a very long answer.
Thank you.
But it's not done just in a vacuum, like sometimes it feels like it is. And I will say, sometimes I will answer that question very sarcastically, but truly there was thought into the process. And I will be honest, especially right now, the folks who are in our office, we are all very intellectually driven around these ideas around screening and identification of giftedness. And this is a topic that we debate on a very frequent basis. Partly because we're interested in it, and partly because we want to do what's best for students. And we are trying to identify barriers and break down those barriers so that we can catch as many of our students as possible and make sure they are properly identified. Another piece that changed in 2019, and again, it feels like semantics, but it's actually important, in that previously it said that we should have 10% of our district identified as gifted. And now what it says is at least a significant number of students in every school, and at least 10% of students across your district. And the reason that's important is because prior to that, they would look at our district numbers. And as you can imagine, in a district like MCPS, we very easily passed and surpassed that 10%. At one point, we had some schools where 40% or more of the students were identified as gifted, which is mathematically impossible, but we did it anyway. But then on a whole, we had some schools where there were maybe 1 or 2% of the students identified as gifted, and other schools that were 40% or more. So again, on average, that came out to over 10%. Changing that means that we have to look at each and every school. We have to kind of look more holistically. And then it also forced us to break down our students into different groups and subgroups to see if we were making progress in those identifications. And while that's not formally reported, those are things that we do monitor within our schools, or within our office rather. And this is where I'll throw in where we have caveats. We are allowed to identify schools where we don't have to meet that 10%. So for example, Rock Terrace, where our students who are placed there are placed for special education. They are there because they are on alternative learning outcomes, meaning that they are on a certificate-bound pathway. That is a school that is excluded. We don't have to identify 10%. However, we've had teachers from Rock Terrace take this course, where again, we can talk about what does giftedness look like in a relative population. So while we have 10% as a whole, meeting a certain set of parameters, if we looked at Rock Terrace in its own small microcosm, 10% of their students are going to have different cognition or a higher cognition than their peers. And so being able to make some of those adjustments within their own building is an important thing to keep in mind. And it's something that I really enjoy seeing how people are interpreting and really helping students reach their full potential, even if in the larger context, they don't meet that concept of twice exceptional or gifted. Another piece that we have, and I will be honest, we're still working on this. We had some procedures before, we don't have them now. We talk about this idea of advanced learning behaviors. And what we do right now is we capture we capture teacher input and we capture parent input, and that becomes a part of the profile and screening that we do for students. In the past, we had other ways to capture this, and there's a lot of debate and interest on how we can capture advanced learning behaviors without using testing. Some districts will do portfolios, some districts will do kind of rubrics, if you will. Part of the problem is we screen 12 to 13,000 students, and that's a lot of profiles and a lot of rubrics. And so that's not a direction we go in right now, but it is something that, trying to figure out the best way to capture some of that data, because that is often where we identify our less identified populations of students, such as our twice exceptional students. That is more about traditionally underrepresented programs and services. I'm not going to read all this to you guys. I have these things available so that you can click on them. We do talk about how school systems must provide a continuum of programs and services beyond those normally provided in a regular school program. So what that looks like is different in each district, but we have to have something beyond the base curriculum for our students who are identified as gifted. One piece we get asked about frequently is, when we look at our CES, Centers for Enriched Studies, or our magnet programs, whether or not a student is identified as gifted is not a parameter that's considered. And so it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, you would think that all the students who are identified as gifted would have a mark, a leg up, something to get into those programs. On the other hand, you know, not all students who are gifted are identified as such for a variety of reasons. Students peak at different times, they have interest in different areas, and so it is important to keep in mind that we don't want to put barriers in place. And so being identified gifted is not a parameter or a barrier to getting into some of our advanced programs. Interesting thought, always good for a chat later as to what that really means, but that is what we have right now. This piece here is on professional learning, and I'm always just excited to say that our course is aligned to COMAR. So we are meeting COMAR by you guys taking this class, and yay for me. And then if you guys grab this presentation when the course is working, if you really are just that person, you need some good bedtime reading, here are the links for the full text for COMAR. The Gifted and Talented Education Specialist also came into play in 2019, and you can become a gifted specialist in Maryland. And that talks about that. I actually got to go through that program as one of the first people in the state, and lots of fun, lots of exciting, shiny piece of paper on the wall. So if you're interested in any of those classes, I'm always happy to talk about those as well when we're not recording. All right, where are we at? We are at 7:40. So I'm going to try this. Oh, good, you can see it. So I don't think I'm going to get necessarily through all this before our break. I guess I'm going to actually stop for a hot minute and just see if anybody has questions. Yes, you will have access to the slides once I get the class working tomorrow. The good side is I have a training scheduled tomorrow and with my twice exceptional case managers. And the bad thing is it was supposed to be a full day. I blocked off a full day, but somehow it only ends up as a half day. So I have a whole half day unscheduled. So I will be putting my course back together. So yay for tomorrow. I'm not seeing any questions. And truly, y'all can interrupt me because, I mean, I get sick of my own voice sometimes, and I'm sure you do too. So I'm gonna pop us back over. Um, so some of the things in here I'm going to reference are actually going to be things I want you guys to do on your own. One thing I can't stand is sitting and watching videos, especially like on Zoom. Um, I know I did a clip here and there, but I do like having a lot of different options. One, because I think it's good practice to show the things we can do in the classroom for our students. And two, because there are some days I only want to listen to podcasts, and there are some days I only want to read. And so I try and make all of those provide options for you guys, depending on what mood you're in. There are some times where I will put up and I'm like, I really want you guys to watch this or listen to this or read this particular article. Um, and we're going to see that when we get to the dual diagnosis piece. But first, we're going to talk a little bit more about masking. So we heard it mentioned by Matt. We heard it mentioned in both of our definitions of twice exceptionality. And so we're really going to go a little bit deeper into what is masking. The first way that we often will look at our masking is when our students are gifted, and that gift is what is forward presenting. So frequently what we'll see is a student who, these are the students who they tend to say are, they're lazy, or they're just not trying very hard, because they're very clearly gifted. What they aren't clearly is, what they are not clearly showing is what that disability is. I often get described like this, especially when I was a student, because I very much, and probably still, was of the opinion that I already know this. I don't need to show you that I know this, because I already know that I know this. So why am I going to bother doing whatever it is you're asking me? Any subject didn't matter. I just didn't do it. And so I frequently was like, why is she lazy? She's not really motivated. She doesn't do much work. Um, what was driving some of that in the background with the ADHD was, you might say it was only copying 10 sentences. What you don't know is I sat at my desk for sometimes 2 or 3 hours at home trying to force myself to copy 10 sentences on a paper. Um, I couldn't do it. I don't know why. I still don't know why I can't do it. And even when my parents got me a computer, it was back in the 80s. That was really cool, by the by. Um, I amazingly fast typer. I still could not type those stupid sentences for like language arts or whatever. I couldn't type my spelling words out. I don't know why, but that is part of what this is. And so, I could be called any sorts of names or called different things, but truly what it was is that people didn't understand that there was an actual disability that was preventing me from being able to be, um, preventing me from being able to participate in my work. I also had a behavior problem, but that's a whole different story for a different day. The flip side of this is we have our students where the severity of the disability is masking the giftedness. Um, students who present in this way are the ones where I so frequently hear, there's no way that kid is gifted. Or when I talk to school teams and they're telling me about all these behavior problems, and then they're like, yeah, and then we got this test from an outside provider, and it came back that this kid's gifted, and there's just no way they're gifted. There's a lot of ways that they're gifted. They're just not able to show that giftedness. That disability is so forward presenting that we are having trouble really being able to see where that giftedness lies. Um, I know it says on here, watch a video. So the video will be on the website, um, where our speaker is talking about his dad saying, "What's wrong with you?" Now, nobody's perfect. I will be honest, I probably said that to my daughter 3 times last week. It's not meant to make you feel bad, especially if you have said any of these things before. I will promise you I've said them too, whether out loud in my head or, like I said, to my daughter probably 3 times last week. But the point of it is kind of thinking our way through what's driving us to do these things or say these things are driving that piece of our thinking. Um, a lot of times, especially for those of you who are in upper elementary, middle school, high school, what you guys might see with these students is a lot of the self-doubt, um, a lot of self-doubt, a lot of of disengagement, because some of these guys have been hearing this since they were in kindergarten. And if you have them in ninth grade, that's 8 or 9 years of being told, what's wrong with you? Or there's no way you're gifted, or you can't possibly do this, that, or the other. And so sometimes when we get our kids, they have a lot of past trauma that is impacting their ability to show who they are. And whether or not we, mean to do it or think we're doing it, kids pick up, and especially kids with these profiles pick up very quickly on how other people feel about them. And also when you have, somewhat with autism, but especially with ADHD, where you have and then the word recall goes out of my brain. But you have that ability to project negative feelings on everything all of the time, where you just kind of go into life assuming everybody hates you, and you constantly expect people to disprove that dislike of you. Um, when you feel, or when people are projecting that out, you really feel it much more sharply, and you internalize it a lot more and hang on to it a lot longer. Then we have these friends. These are our friends who the disability and the giftedness end up with a student who looks average but is anything but. These are our kids who are kind of at grade level, maybe a little above, maybe a little below. They don't really seem like, something's going on. Um, they don't really seem like they're all that gifted or advanced, but they also don't seem like they're all that disabled or struggling. Um, But what you actually are having is a child who's not having any of their needs met. And oftentimes with these friends, what we really see is they are, because they're struggling on both ends and they're not having either of their sets of needs met, they're kind of hovering in the middle, but they're falling further and further behind on skills that are important. Um, and what they're really getting better at doing is the masking piece. So they are ones that are hard to find. Sometimes they also hit that point where they just sort of fall apart and everybody's like, what just happened here? And it's like, well, what happened is we had a kid who was struggling on both ends of the spectrum, having neither end of the spectrum meet, and eventually they just couldn't keep it together and they kind of fall apart. Um, a lot of times, I personally believe, I wouldn't say I necessarily have research for it, but I personally believe that these are a lot of the kids who are suddenly, quote unquote, suddenly being diagnosed as twice exceptional with anxiety, with depression, with things that are suddenly cropping up when they're in high school, when not only do the academic demands increase, but the social demands increase. And they've just sort of been floating this whole time and not really sure how to ask for more enrichment or more help. And they just kind of fall apart. Um, these students are ones also who, you know, because those strengths mask those weaknesses, what is strong does remain strong. A lot of times they are very good listeners, great verbal skills, can't write for anything. And so, they're doing well in class. They can tell you about the story they're writing. They can tell you all these things. And when you ask for it, it's not there. But they can tell you all about it. And that's part of that masking piece that's coming through the writing, where they're not getting the writing piece down. These kids also will pick up the content really quickly, but not necessarily be able to express it in the way that you're asking them to. Um, they're hard to find. That's why we have a glass on it. But it's important to know that they're there and that they have these needs. Um, and that sometimes when we're looking at our kids and we just know something isn't quite right, sometimes knowing about these masking things or knowing that this exists helps you better question what might be going on with a kid. So if you have that kid where you're like, I just don't know, but there's something different here, these are good questions to ask yourself. Is this a child who is not having any of their needs met, but and as a result, they're just kind of looking like they're struggling, but nobody knows why. Um, it lets us kind of dig into that a little bit more. That was the same one. Oh, how long is this video? I don't remember. I'm gonna have us keep going because we're gonna take a break in a few minutes.
So every night at the dinner tip.
No?
So every
Come on.
night at the dinner tip, with my, so every night at the dinner table with my,
You know, we're gonna watch this because clearly the video wants to be shown.
my pops, it was Jonathan, stop it, stop it, stop it. What is wrong with you? I was the kid in middle school who had such a hard time keeping his mouth shut that I grew up with Shirley, the receptionist, in the principal's office, right? And in high school, I was a kid who had such a hard time with reading that I spent most of the day hiding in the bathroom with tears streaming down my face. I did not learn to read until I was 12 years old. Couldn't read until I was 12. I struggled with anxiety, with depression, and I had a plan for suicide. I was diagnosed with a whole bunch of language-based learning disabilities. I was turned in to a problem. You know, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for this guy named Mr. R. I'll tell you about Mr. R real quick. So when I met Mr. R, he would always ask, you know, after school, during school, what are you good at, Jonathan? And all I ever heard about in special ed wasn't what I was good at, but what I was bad at. So he'd ask me what I was good at, and I'd say, nothing. I'm not good at anything, Mr. R. And then one day he came to me, and he said, hey, Jonathan, I've been watching you. And I think, I know that you are really good at telling stories. You are so good at telling stories that you could be a writer. No one's ever said that to me before. I was 9 years old, a writer? I looked at him and said, are you out of your goddamn mind, Mr. R? I can't spell to save my life. Mr. R looked right at me and he said, Jonathan, screw spelling. For the first time, somebody told me to forget what I can't do and focus on what I can do. And that changed my life. I went and transcended those odds. And I went to live a life that I'm proud of today. I have people in my life who helped me understand that I wasn't a problem. We got a national tragedy on our hands right now of young folks leaving school and feeling dumb. Don't know about y'all, but some of the smartest people I have ever met in my life, they did not do well in school. They couldn't read or write well, but they could rebuild the car engine from scratch. Everybody has that right to an education that's not about what's wrong with them, but what's right. And every single human being has something good that they can build a life around. Find the good and share it with the children in your life. And every child deserves that. You know, when I was in that hallway, chilling out with Robert, the custodian, there were days when he was the only adult that would speak. There were days where he was the only person that I felt in my life cared for me as a human being. And that matters. That's the work that you all do every single day.
All right, well, I'm not going to post that video because we just watched it. But I do really like the sentiment that he's capturing there, right? Like, most of the time, our twice exceptional kids are hearing what's wrong with them. They're not being given that opportunity to show where they're gifted because we're always trying to fix where they're not gifted. And we'll definitely get into this more deeply as we move through this course. But one thing that I definitely want to make sure that we really start to think about and look at and understand is that having disabilities aren't things that necessarily need to be fixed. Really, a lot of what we need is to accept, you know, that people are who they are, and that, you know, sometimes it's things like the environment that's broken. It's not those of us with those disabilities. And I think that those are some really important things. And I have a couple of other videos that I'm not going to go into today. Um, but they really talk about this idea that, you know, when you have a disability such as, um, when you have a disability such as autism or ADHD or any of those, you know, anxiety diagnoses things, those are all things that talk about how your brain works. And your brain is not broken, it just functions differently. Um, you know, it's not an illness to be cured. And when we reframe how we look at these variations in how people's brains work, we do a better job of honoring who they are. And that is a big piece of understanding what twice exceptionality is, because twice exceptional brains are very different than gifted brains. They're very different than average brains. They're very different than brains with different cognitive abilities. Um, and that just makes them unique. But part of what that also means is that when you're twice exceptional all the time. You are not just twice exceptional in school, but you are twice exceptional at home. You are twice exceptional in, um, you're twice exceptional at work. You're twice exceptional in the car. You know, it's always there. And with that, we are just about at 8 o'clock. So I'm going to have us take our break. Um, can we just plan to be back at 8:10? Sound good to everybody? And then I always will pause during the break and back on. And so one question that came through was somebody who said, when it comes to that masking piece, that child who looks average, um, how do we bring up that topic or have that discussion around going to child find and going to testing? Which is not necessarily the same thing, but I'm going to talk about them kind of at the same time. So I think one of the things we want to talk about when we're looking at whether or not we want to move forward any child for, you know, child find for 504 or for an IEP, and whether or not we need to go to testing, is we want to ask the question around educational impact. And you will hopefully hear me talk about this quite a bit in the next couple of weeks. But a lot of times when I sit at tables, what I hear from teams is, you know, they have all A's, they're doing fine, their MAP scores are good, and that's all great. What I want to make sure that we are not limiting ourselves to is academic measures, because when we talk about education, that is a holistic approach. That is talking about a child's academic needs, their social emotional needs, their, you know, just social interaction needs. There's a lot of different pieces that make up what is education for a student. Is some of this philosophical? Absolutely. But if we have a student who is struggling to keep it together all day long, um, you know, and they start having outbursts when they're having to do group work because it's taking so much for them to keep themselves okay or average. And then you present them with working with a group and they don't have the wherewithal um, to have social interactions. That could be a piece of this. If a student doesn't know how to, you know, navigate all of the pieces of their day, and you know, they can do really well as long as there's someone who's there prompting them through all the executive functioning pieces of their day, you know, task initiation, task shifting, subject shifting, moving from one thing to another. Like, what level of support is it taking? And what level are we expecting at that age, whatever age it is, for them to be more independent? And are they progressing towards that independence? Are they progressing slowly or not at all? As somebody with an executive function disability, who's also the executive functioning brain in the household, God help us all, this is a really important thing. And so for me, what I've learned over time is I can't fix my executive functioning disability, but what I can do is find the tools to work with. And I had to get good at recognizing when I'm messing things up so that I can apply the right tool to fix it. Um, if students can't do that, and also knowing that that part of your brain doesn't fully develop until you're 25, and if you are on the ADHD or autism spectrum, it doesn't fully develop until you're closer to 30. Those are going to be some hard things to measure, but again, if that is impacting your ability to access school, if that's impacting your ability to be educated, not just your academics, those are definitely questions that to talk about. I do run into, and again, to me, this is almost a philosophical question. I've had quite a few situations recently, and I'll say I have a situation similar to this with my family, where my kid can hold it together all day long. They're fantastic at school. She comes home and she falls apart because it's taking so much out of her during the day to keep everything together. But when I talk to the school team, she's interacting socially, she's doing all the things you would expect to do, and then she just kind of falls apart at home. And it's really hard because there's a part of me that's like, can we do more at school to help her out? And then there's a part of me that's like, well, then it's not, is it impacting her education if she's able to access school all day long? That said, we've done some really cool things with the school team using what we use for other general education students to help a variety of students out and try and help her navigate some of these pieces so that she's not falling apart every day when she gets home. It's all really nuanced, and I know that it feels like a cop-out answer in some ways, because I know what people really want me to say is say XYZ, ABC, and then you're right there. For me, it's always about asking questions. Why are we at the table discussing this? What brought forth the concerns? What are we seeing in multiple different settings? And what do we suspect or know that is not happening that we anticipate should happen? If you think about what Jonathan Mooney was saying, where, his teacher's like, you tell great stories, and he's not writing things down because he can't spell. Does he need more instruction around spelling? Does he have a disability in that area? Kind of prompting forth based on what his strengths and needs are. How do we have that conversation? I hope that's helpful. It's not a straightforward answer, but hopefully it helps. Um, and hopefully. So I want to talk a little bit more around this identification piece. And as you probably are seeing, as you're seeing different dates and things pop up on the screen, I do try and work smarter, not harder. So, I tend to change some of these presentations and pull up bits and pieces of things because we really are learning stuff all of the time. And so I don't know what my point was in that. It's also why there's a lot of different colors. So one thing I did also want to talk about, and I danced around this a little bit before, but when we talk about what is gifted, because that can be a super hot button topic, especially nowadays. And we do actually, especially in the gifted world, differentiate between giftedness and a high ability performer, or a high ability learner, or a high ability student. We also use those terms interchangeably. And I will own that I often use these terms interchangeably, not because I think they're the same thing, but because often when we think about what our services are and what our programs are and what we provide for, we are providing for that group of students in a very same or similar way, even though they technically have very different needs. So I pulled up our, I'm going to say, quote unquote, official definition of giftedness from NAGC. This was approved back in 2019, so about the same time as COMAR. And so one thing that we said is that these are students or people who have the ability or capability to perform at higher levels than those compared to same age, experience, environment. So right away, that right there is important, because one thing we are saying here is that we need to compare similar to similar. I don't want to say like to like, but we want to say similar to similar. when we talk about things like local norming, which is a fraught conversation, one of the ideas around local norming is that, if I take a group of students from rural Appalachia and I compare them to a bunch of students who live in the Upper East Side of New York, those are vastly different experiences, and vastly different resources, vastly different understandings. And if I give them the same test, they're not going to perform the same regardless of how intelligent they are. But what I can do is give them the same test, break them out, and then look at them within the results within their own group to see how they compare to similar students. Because all tests have biases. We know that. No matter how much we try to unbias things, everything has bias to it. And so one of the things we can do to mitigate that is to compare similar to similar so that we can have sort of a clearer picture. It goes back a little bit to the idea of relative giftedness, but in this case, we're talking in much larger populations where we have people of across an entire continuum of learning and understanding. So we do talk about how our students need modifications and changes to their educational experiences. These students do not learn the same as other students do because their brains are different. And that is part of the process in trying to understand this. And we will talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. I also put in the caveat, I am not a school psychologist, bless you who are. And I talk about this in teacher language, not in school psychologist language. And one of the projects you can do in the long run for this class is actually take some of this and put it in a way where school psychologists can speak to school psychologists or the like, so that you guys are using your professional language to talk through some of these different pieces. So we talk about how they come from all racial, ethnic, cultural populations, as well as all economic strata. We want to talk about how they need access to appropriate learning opportunities. It's not just the fact that they require them, but they need to access them. And that is problematic across the country. Right in our national definition, they can have learning and processing disorders, which require intervention accommodations. Those are our twice exceptional students. They need different guidance for social and emotional development. We will talk more about asynchrony in another part of the class, but we do know that without disability, gifted students have very different social and emotional needs, and they have a very different, they have large discrepancies when it comes to their intellectual age versus their emotional age, and at the rate that they develop with each other. And so those are important things to know, that we do need to teach them some of those skills more explicitly and differently. And that their needs will change over time, like all students. And so while we don't say you like identify or disidentify students as gifted, we need to understand that developmentally people change over time, and what was appropriate at one age might not be appropriate at another. So I want to throw out some theoretical frameworks in here that I like to different levels, but I also think it's important to give us some language and some framing around what it is that we're talking about. So these are some of the popular frameworks out there. I also appreciate that we have a new framework that is being developed. We were super, super hopeful that MCPS could be part of the research with that. But well, now I don't know if the grant itself is going to be funded anyway, but we are working our way through the bureaucracy of asking for research approval. So we can talk about what we're hoping to see, but we'll go from there. So the first theory we have here is this theory of successful intelligence. And this idea is that having fixed definitions of giftedness or IQ is not accurate, and not, I don't like the word fair, but it's the only one that's coming to mind right now. Intelligence is about adaptation. And so successful intelligence describes people who can successfully adapt to new environs. I think a great way to look at it in some ways is when we talk about like our different generations. And as we change over time, there are some people who adapt to these changes more quickly. So our, you know, say the baby boomer generation who was able to quickly adapt to using computers as part of their everyday life. When I think about my parents, I had my dad who thought cell phones were the devil. And I mean, he did finally own one. I don't exactly remember what it took to get us there. Versus my mom, who, can text and this and that and everything else. And technically they're the same generation, but, my mom adapted much better. Um, that's a really short, simple definition, but it kind of hopefully drives home that point. Um, this is a very real world approach. It also kind of goes back to what Jonathan Mooney was saying earlier. You have a student who maybe can't read, but they can take apart and reassemble an engine with no manual. They just do it. Not unlike me, who can just take it apart and it's never going back again. Not successful intelligence there. But, it's that idea that you are intelligent in that setting. And that really is, talks about how we approach our environment and how we use what we have available to us in order to demonstrate our intelligence. Gardner and his multiple intelligences theory. I know this was super big, especially when I was going through grad school and everybody was all about multiple intelligences. What I like about this is if we don't over rely on this idea of multiple intelligences. I know one thing they were kind of teaching us back in the olden days, like 20 something years ago, was that you were linguistic or you were logical or you were this or that. Truthfully, everybody has a little bit of all of it, and you have more dominant areas and less dominant areas. And it's a really good way to get to know yourself as a learner. It's not necessarily something that we are measuring per se or identifying, but when we do talk about different ways to identify giftedness, we do actually talk about how we could identify giftedness within specific domains as opposed to kind of a broad level gifted with, I guess in that case, a capital G. One thing I also do appreciate and hear that I find really interesting, and I don't have a response for it, it's interesting, that some of the IQ tests and some of the things that we put value on right now, in terms of intelligence, were good predictors of 20th century success. But we are now in the 21st century, and we don't necessarily know if these are good predictors of modern success. So I think it's just kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind. So this is a differentiated model of gifts and talents. And I like this also because it's an international perspective, and I think sometimes it's good to get our heads out of the United States and see other people's perspectives, and other cultures' perspectives of giftedness. What I like with this specifically is that Gagne differentiates between giftedness and talents. And that is one of those areas where we call it gifted and talented. We say GT or gifted and talented, but we don't always express them differently. And truly they are different terms. And so while yes, he talks about, that 10% range, which we actually saw back in Comar in the Maryland definition, what he talks about here is the idea that giftedness is spontaneous. Giftedness is more innate, something that you are born with. This is what we would more think about traditionally as like that IQ piece, whereas talents are things that you can develop. And so talents are things that you might have something that you are untrained and uniquely born with, but if you don't develop it and it doesn't go anywhere, is it really a gift or is it just there? Whereas something that you work with and build over time can become a talent. And then you have the people who work systematically to get themselves to that top piece. I think this works really well with some of Dweck's work around the idea of fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. It's not to say that giftedness is fixed and unchangeable, because you do need to work on it and develop it, but it also builds that idea that intelligence is not just, or giftedness is not just about what you're born with, but it's also about what you develop. And I think, you know, and sometimes when I said before, when we think about the difference between um, a gifted learner versus an advanced learner or a highly able learner, one of those differences is that those are the kids who are good at school. They have learned how to be productive in the classroom. They have learned how to transition, get their work done, prioritize, do what it is that they need to do. And whether it's something they were naturally good at or a skill that they've built, they are good at that, also that executive functioning piece of being able to shift between tasks and move themselves throughout the day. And so it is a way to look at it, because you weren't born good at school, but you can develop a talent for school. And I think that that's an important piece to look at. Renzulli's three-ring concept of giftedness, this is one that is one of the more longer universal concepts that we use when we talk about this. I also really like Renzulli's got a lot of data and research around the idea of talent development. And so part of what he has with his three-ring conception of giftedness is he also has a concept of talent development, and he actually has done a lot of work in doing like whole school talent development models. I swear the man is 80 and still going strong. I just saw him at a conference recently, and he still is all excited about this. This is one of those few things out there that this is from, I think it's 1972, and it is still truly relevant. So he talks about how giftedness is considered to be an interaction of these three basic areas. You can have people who have one, two, or three of these areas, but truly gifted is the intersection and application of all three of them. And so he talks about this above average ability. So that kind of is a little bit about what Garnier was talking about. Commitment to task or motivation. So giftedness requires motivation. It's not just I'm born with something good and that's that, but I'm motivated to do something with it. And then also that high level of creativity. Creativity is one of those intangibles that we hear about a lot in gifted ed, and in twice exceptionality. For better or for worse, our kids, that seems to be their area of strength, regardless of where their areas of need are. They are creative whether or not we want them to be. And I often will say, you know, one of the differences between a gifted kid and a twice exceptional kid is that a gifted kid will come up with creative responses, and our twice exceptional kid will act on them. They will find something to keep themselves occupied, whether or not you like it. And so when we have people who kind of have that intersection of all three, then they are able to express that. One thing I think is interesting he has here, gifted behaviors can be found in certain people, but not all people, at certain times, but not all the times, and in the right circumstance, but not all circumstances. So there's a lot of like caveats on here. And part of the reason this is important is because it's partly why he also went with that talent development model, because in the talent development model, we create the circumstances in order for people to show what their talents are and provide time for them to show those talents. So all of that being said, we are still at the point in the world where we can't learn unless we take a test first and last, and everything is based on assessments. Yes, that is a lot of cynicalness, but hey, it's also 8:30. I can be cynical now. So really what I want to do is I want to talk through some of these assessments. Again, this is me as the teacher. So my psychologists who are here, if you would like to pop in anything, please feel free to. So most of the tests that we look at when we talk about intelligence, giftedness, ability, whatever you want to call it, primarily we are looking at memory, problem-solving skills, decision-making abilities, learning, aptitude, as well as learning abilities, attention, and creativity. We have some different sets of tests. So we have individual tests, the ones that we are probably most familiar with, especially in psychologist and special ed world, the WISC And if you don't know, WISC 6 is, oh God, that's even harder to say, WISC 5, isn't it? WISC 6 is actually out. It will be replacing in the next 2 years, but it was just released. I've seen the front cover paper copy because I have friends who are psychologists and this is what we do with our free time. I don't know a whole lot about it now. I'd be very interested to see in kind of how some of these changes have come about. I do know one big change from WISC 4 to WISC 5 was that more things were timed, and we actually saw some significant changes in scores of kids who were twice exceptional because things that they were good at when they weren't timed, it impacted them in that new version. I don't know anything about how this new one has changed, but I'm very interested to see it. The Kaufman is usually what we call it, the K-bit 2, but most people call it the Kaufman. And then the Stanford Binet is one of the older tests. You don't often see it as much, but you usually also, I think, see it. Personally, I mostly see it with younger students. And then there are other ones. Those are tests that are administered one-to-one with a person who I'm just going to say knows what they're doing. They're trained to do it, and they're also trained to interpret it. And that's why they're school psychologists and have fancy letters after their names. We also have group tests. So if you are a second or third grade teacher, you have heard COGAT so many times in the last 6 weeks that you never want to hear it again. I feel you. I've actually made really good friends with the people at COGAT and got to hang out with some of them back in, we're such nerds, got to hang out with some of them back in November at our national conference and got a lot of insight into COGAT. It was more than most people need. We also have InView, which is what we used to do back in the olden days. And I'll say the biggest reason that we stopped is because it's paper. And obviously then it's the same tests all the time. There was no change or adaptation. And so we don't do that one anymore. It might be on not paper nowadays. I don't actually know. SAGES, the NNAT. There's also the new Naglieri nonverbal, the OLSAT, which is the OS Lemon. All of these are group tests, meaning whether you do them in small group, large group, whatever, they are done sitting in that larger group. They are scored usually by a computer or kind of Scantron or whatever, and there's not a lot of interpretation that goes with them. They will do, I'm going to go with the word numerical interpretation, like, you run it through and you get different, what am I looking for? You get different interpretations of what the scores could be because we look at, say, nonverbal and verbal. We look at verbal and quantitative. We look at quantitative and nonverbal. We look at all three of them. We look for patterns and answers, lots of different things that you can extrapolate, but we don't get the nuance that you would in the WISC of like, but the student was very agitated this day and they reacted this way to this certain question, and this might mean this, that, or the other. You don't get that level of interpretation with them. But they are fairly good as far as giving us an idea of where students' strengths lie. So you don't see the word IQ in any of those. And that is true because they don't produce necessarily IQ scores straight out. They produce raw scores in verbal areas, nonverbal areas. Quantitative is another area. Visual spatial reasoning, how students are able to look at pictures and interpret how they relate to each other. And you get lots of subtest scores and composite scores, which is when we look at all those little pieces together. And that comes up with this magic number that we call IQ. That's my teacher explanation for it. But one thing that we also know is that, like anything else, like if we go back to what I said very early on, if I have one school that's at 40% gifted and one school that's at 1% gifted, then my district is over 10% on average. We often see this with a lot of these, and especially when we talk about our twice exceptional kids, they will be extremely high in one area and extremely low or average in another area. And so much of understanding who they are is about understanding we can't look at those average scores because it doesn't tell us who our kids are. Because if I'm extraordinarily high in one area and extraordinarily low in the other area, I'm not magically average. I am both high and low. Um, and that often is where the nuance lies in understanding what it is that a twice exceptional kid is and what it is that they need. So other things that we can do to look at giftedness, they have the Torrance tests of creative thinking. Those are ones that you do need to be instructed on how to interpret them. We have rating scales that we put out for teachers and students. Students can also do self-rating scales. We can do interviews. I said earlier we could do portfolios that collect both performance and aptitude of what it is students produce. If you're in a Title I elementary school, talk to your primary talent development person because they collect portfolios on their students over the course of 3 years to show what their growth and development look like um, based on the instruction that they give. Overall, there's a lot of different ways that we can collect this data. One thing you will notice in everything that I've laid out here in front of us is there's no um, academic testing. None of this takes into account performance because we're looking at potential. And that also can become a very nuanced discussion when we're talking, especially at like IUP meetings about, when we're writing goals, do we write for potential or do we write for performance? Do we write for this or that? I don't have a solid answer for that. I can argue both sides of it. So, it's something to be aware of and to make note about. So student COGAT data. I don't know. Sorry, that was a cop-out answer. We have about 26,000 data points that we are trying to figure out how to get out of COGAT platform and into Performance Matters platform. Individual schools, your principals, your testing coordinators should be able to see student data. So again, if you are in a spot where an IEP team needs to know information, go to your principal and go to your testing coordinator or JT liaison and ask them if they can pull up the COGAT dashboard because they can pull individual student data right now, but it's not going to be released fully out to everybody until May or June. I'm not even sure how much we can publicly use that data, but I do know that school teams can look at it I'm going to say in isolation, and it doesn't have a lot of interpretation with it right now. It just basically has some raw scores in there. I will also ask my supervisor if I can give a better answer because she might have a better answer. I have not been playing with that. I was on the delivery end of COGAT. I am not on the back end of COGAT right now, so I don't have the best answer. Okay, so in this last little bit today, I'm going to go over some theoretical numbers because that's how my brain works. So yeah, you guys get to work how my brain works. So generally speaking, when we talk about a gifted population, what we're talking about is students who are people, not just students. People who are highly gifted make up the top 1 to 2% of their given population. And that's that like little bit of red is the 1% and the orange gets us to 2%. Renzulli's 3-ring concept tells us that we could be as high as 12.5% when we talk about, people with the right conditions at the right time and all those pieces on his rings tell us we can have about 12.5% of a population to consider gifted as opposed to highly or profoundly gifted. We then have this area, I'm going to go with this as more of like a grayish area in research, but basically the concept of it is that there is a certain chunk of the population, about 25% of the population, that if you expose them to specific instruction around this concept of talent development. So if you think back again to what we're doing with our primary talent development coaches in Title I schools, if we expose up to 25% of the population to, or rather, if we expose the population to talent development models and teach them conceptual thinking, teach them creativity, teach them creative and critical thinking skills, about 25% of that population will show gifted abilities. And so you fall into that talent. They might not rise to that top, 12%, but they will show aptitude in different areas, and that would be our talent development area. And then you have about 60% of your population for the rest of the general population. What's interesting is that when we look at this in terms of the disability side of things, we actually, and this does not look like a bell curve because I was in the mood, and I like colors. But we kind of see very similar numbers on the other side when we talk about, you know, severe, profound cognitive disabilities, mild intellectual, cognitive impairment, physical and or mental disabilities. And then we again have that general population in the middle who are neither strongly gifted nor strongly disabled. They're just kind of in the middle. But again, in this circle model, a lot of the kids we're talking about kind of fall into those very small areas at the top of the circle, like this sort of area. One thing I talk about very frequently is a lot of the way our instructional worlds are built. Students who fall in this lower percentile of the bell curve, that's special education. And we have a lot of resources dedicated to special education. But we have an equal number of students who are on the opposite end of that bell curve who also have differently functioning brains and different needs. And we dedicate almost zero resources to students on that end of the spectrum. And so that becomes to me just one of those pieces to talk about. And one of the podcasts that I ask everyone to listen to is on the case for dual diagnosis and how we can go through dual diagnosis. And one thing the speaker tells us is profound giftedness occurs in this at the same level in population as profound cognitive impairment. Gifted brains are different. They function different. They look different. They are different. But yet we treat them like they're the same because we call them quote unquote gifted. And so it kind of brings in a philosophical and moral question of if we have two groups of people who have brains that are different than most height build and than the majority of the population, why does one side get resources and the other side does not? And how do we make that determination? Interestingly, also those who fall in that profoundly gifted area tend to have very significant social needs. And they don't get addressed because people see them as gifted and see them as having a gift. And there's some great articles out there, like when giftedness is not a gift. So again, I think it's really interesting to think about. We'll come back to bell curves a little bit later. And if you're not quite understanding where bell curves work, what we're really seeing here is that 96% of the population falls in these standard deviations between an IQ score of 70 and 130, where 100 is average. It's right in the middle. Most of the people that we are talking about that I work with are students who fall in this last 2% on this side of the bell curve, and they also fall in the last 2% on this side of the bell curve. That's not perfect. One example I have is one of our teachers who teaches this class along with me. She took this class, loved the theory, the field, is getting her master's degree in twice exceptionality right now. She is also a twice exceptional learner on the spectrum. And one thing she had shared with us is that she has a verbal IQ of 157. So if you look on this little bell curve thing, she's off the chart, literally. Like she's all the way out over here somewhere. But her visual spatial IQ ability is an 87, which is right over here somewhere. That is a significant and profound difference. And so, and then that is the type of profile that we're looking at, is when we have these extremes within the same person, whereas more typical people will have their scores kind of spread out in this blue area in the middle. So scores do not equal need, just like programs or disability codes don't drive placement in programs. We have to look at individuals for what it is that they need. It's also very interesting that Common behaviors of gifted children are often mistaken as symptoms of disabilities. Um, Gifted children are intense. They have a strong drive. They have high needs with perfectionism. They tend to be very impatient and oppositional, and what one might deem as hyperactive, which is usually often excitement or overexcitement for what their areas of interest are. So it's important when we're looking at our students to figure out what is truly a disordered behavior versus what is a normal range of gifted behavior for a gifted child. And like I said, we're going to go into equity kind of hardcore in a week or so, but we also need to know that this is where most of the bias, especially when it comes to racial bias, comes in, is understanding that things that are typical normal behavior for gifted children are very easily interpreted as emotional or emotionally disturbed behavior in students of color. And that is something to be very aware of. So just a couple of quick comparisons. When we talk about asynchronicity, the idea of asynchronicity really is that you have multiple ages at once. You are highly developed in some areas and average or low developed in other areas. So an example would be a student who is, let's say, 5 or 6 years old, who is reading college level textbooks on space because they're very interested in space science. They have the ability to write that of a 3 or 4 year old. They're not good at holding a pencil or writing their answers. And they might think very very slowly, very pointedly, but it's because they are thinking very deeply um, about a topic, and yet their expression might not come out as clearly when they're speaking about it. They also often will have trouble connecting with peers because what 5 year old wants to talk about Stephen Hawking's, brief history of time, um, which can make them look socially impaired when truly it's just that their interests are so divergent, they don't have anybody to talk to. Our twice exceptional students will have an impairment, and there is a difference in impairment in some of these domains where um, it's not just below average social skills, but perhaps completely undeveloped social skills. They are not able to interact positively with peers. They're not able to express themselves in a way that is not harmful to themselves or others. Um, there are differences there. Part of those differences are gifted students do need instruction in social skills, whereas a twice exceptional student might need a full formalized intervention where they're being systematically taught parameters of social skills. So another example is when we have asynchronicity within the area of strength. And this is a really interesting one, I think, because um, this is when we see some of that high level masking. This is when we have a student who might be a highly gifted reader in terms of um, being able to comprehend at a very high level, but they are impaired or unable to decode. So our students who can listen, I had a student many years ago who we still don't actually know what it was, but he literally could not read. He could not he could identify the sound of letters, but he could not put the letters together and blend the sounds. Um, he had been in reading interventions for 6, 7, 8 years at that point, and that was where his disability was. But I read Animal Farm to him, and he would say things like, "Oh, hey, hold up. Could you go back 3 paragraphs and read the first 3 sentences of that paragraph there? Because I think that's what I'm looking for." And I would read it to him, and he's like, no, go back another like 2 sentences. And yeah, that's what I want. Okay, start reading from there again. He comprehended everything we were reading, but he couldn't read his own name on paper. We got really good at speech to text. We got really good at providing verbal answers. But if I had asked him to write his understanding of Animal Farm, we would still be sitting here. So it's understanding that sometimes that discrepancy can be within the area of giftedness. We also need to remember that giftedness is not across the board. So that gifted reader might also only have average math skills, or again, this particular student was highly gifted in math. And so one of the biggest issues we had was that he hated getting support in math class because, as we know, math has a lot of word problems in it, especially now, and he couldn't read the word problems. And so he would try and guess what he thought the question was asking, and his math scores were not very high. And we found out it was because he was not using his accommodations to have the math questions read to him. But when we pulled him from the class and read his questions to him without anybody near him, he was willing to accept those accommodations and his scores went up. At the same time, having letters in math, having X's, Y's, B's, whatever, none of that impacted him and his ability to solve problems. So it wasn't the letters themselves, it was the sounds of letters. So just a really interesting profile of a student who had a lot of this asynchronicity within his areas of strength and disability. Overexcitabilities, it is way too late in the day to really get into this, but intensities and overexcitabilities are these concepts that gifted people are highly intense and are highly overexcitable in 5 specific areas. And we definitely will go over those at some point. One of the pieces with that though is that when you address that area of giftedness, then it kind of absorbs the intensity. Whereas with a twice exceptional student, it's about more than just that intensity, that it's actually more of a disordered behavior or an impacted behavior. And it impacts their ability to access their education. So providing enrichment and acceleration or whatever is not enough. You have to, again, provide intervention. You have to provide instruction around whatever those areas are. We will have a section on the classroom on overexcitabilities. It's a very interesting area, a very interesting theoretical area. There are some people who live and die by it, and there are some people who don't care for it as a theory. But I don't think it does justice if you don't know what overexcitabilities are and you're living in the gifted or twice exceptional world, because even if you think it's hooey, you can't express that if you don't know what it is. I'm going to do a whole thing on, stop us right there, because I'm going to do a whole thing on perfectionism in another week, different week. Yeah. So we're basically at the end of our first class. And one thing I do at the end of class is I ask about questions. And then the next thing I do is, if I have none or when I've answered them, I will turn off recording and then answer any other questions people have, because some people don't like to ask questions when we're being recorded, and that is perfectly fine. I will also put out that if my schedule doesn't work for you and you want to schedule time after class to talk sometime, give me a heads up and I will plan to stay on. Today is not that day. But do we have any questions in general? Anything I can answer? Anything I missed in the chat? I think I got everything.
Sarah, I have one. This is Amy.
Mhm.
So this was a really interesting conversation. Well, hearing you talk about the differences with and I'm always thinking about the students in my ELC class, and I have one particular student who is not a very good handwriter at all. And given the typing opportunity, she just writes like she comes alive. And so
Mhm.
there are some assignments and such that I have them handwriting on, like Jacob's Ladder and things like that. And she quite often asks if she can type it on a Google Doc and so forth. And sometimes I find that she gets distracted because of other things that the computer will allow you to have.
Mhm.
So in a situation like that, what would be your expertise with allowing her to be able to give the kind of answers that she would be able to give if she were to be able to type it versus handwriting?
So I feel very strongly about assistive technology. I will tell you every single Jacob's Ladder in ELC is available digitally, and I know because Kitty and I wrote
Yeah,
them.
yeah,
But we
right.
did that we did do that in the beginning of the pandemic, but we've kept it available specifically because exactly what you're saying. Now, the challenges and where her instruction needs to be, it sounds like, is in undistracting herself. How do you get her
Sure,
to go to that page and stay on that page? And that's really where the challenge in instruction comes from, often with our students. Other things you can consider doing are having her use voice note and record her thinking so that she's not
okay,
on the computer. I know personally there are times where having a mouse in my hand is the distraction, and if I can keep my hands off my mouse, I can get my work done a little better. Um,
sure,
so thinking about, some different strategies, or if she really just gets distracted every single time she gets on the computer, give her, a 2-minute break to mess around with something on the computer. And then, that part of, especially if ADHD is part of that profile, time blindness is a big part of it. So giving visual timers, where, why don't you write for 5 minutes and then you can play? Why don't you play
sure.
for 2 minutes and then you can write? Um, a lot of my kids really like those sand timers that have the different times on or different colors and whatever on them. And it's a good thing to train them how to use those timers appropriately.
Sure.
In my household,
Okay,
I'll tell you, and again, this is home, not school,
yeah,
but Alexa is our best friend. Um, I don't want to say her name too loud or she'll answer.
sure,
Um, but like I went downstairs on the break and I said to my kiddo, like, why are we not in the shower? And she's like, because I have a timer and she hasn't told me I have to take a shower yet. I'm like, all right, fine. But that's part of
okay,
it. Yes, we argue about it, but at the same time, um, that's one of those strategies. And it took me a long time to teach everybody in the house to use those timers appropriately and not just turn them off or whatever. Because time blindness is such a big issue, anything you can do not only to teach her not to distract herself on the computer, but
yeah,
to maintain time and stick to times. So again, if you're going to play, you have to play for X number of minutes, and then you have to go back to what you're doing. Uh,
got it.
and that also is going to be a big challenge for her. But I mean, as far as the writing piece, ultimately in ELC, I want to know what she can express. And if it's easier for her and more accurate for her to express herself typing, I think it's better to take the time to teach her, even though it will be distracting in the short term, to be successful in her typing in the long term.
Sure, sure. It's really it's difficult to read it, and quite often when I'm grading things, no matter what activity it is, a written response on a note card, just a simple, quick thing that I might grab, I quite often have to ask her to read it to me.
And you might want to consider just having, if it's a quick exit card, you might want to consider having her just come over and tell you her answer and you take a
Sure.
couple of quick bullets on it. Because
Yeah,
I mean, I also was one of those kids, like I can type proficiently, but my handwriting did not become legible until I was probably in my 30s.
got
Uh,
it.
I could have been a doctor. I mean, I have the face of a doctor, but I have the handwriting of a doctor. Um, and even now, my mom sometimes will look at what I write and she's like, I have no idea what this is. Um,
Okay, those are
so
good pointers. I appreciate that. I suppose I'll probably just end up making it available to anybody. I just hate to have them on the computers so much. But
so that is, I will say, an accurate and also it's a philosophical and a generational difference. Um,
yeah,
One thing that I know we hear all the time, especially, I came out of high school and I do work, college and things like that as well. I agree. We don't want them on the screens all of the time. At
hmm,
the same time, fast typing is a much more important skill than handwriting. And this is one of those pieces.
true.
I think it is a very much a generational difference because they're not learning to handwrite, but they're also living in a world where handwriting isn't important or as important. And yes, there's research that says, you know, you learn to do blah, blah, blah better. But there's also research that says, especially students who are dysgraphic or dyslexic will learn spelling better by typing because there is physical memory to it. And for somebody like me, who's like when he's like, you know, screw spelling, by the way, third grade teachers don't like it when you tell them that you taught your third grader that. Um, I may have also said F spelling, but you know, who's counting? But you know, when I think about it in a lot of ways, when I'm trying to spell something and I'm writing it, to me, it feels like a bunch of loops. Everything is the same. When I'm typing, I can tell without looking when I spell a word wrong because my fingers weren't in the right place and I feel it in my hands that it's not spelled correctly. And I think that that's one of those things where this is a different generation of kids. Some of our kids don't like the feel of keyboards. They like the glass and they like the thumb typing. Drives me nuts, but I've watched kids write papers with their thumbs. Um,
Yeah.
you know, when we're thinking, and that goes back to one of those other comments, you know, it's the 21st century and we are all of us, even those of you who are born after 2000, you know, we're really still living in a 20th century world and a 20th century education, but we're not in the 20th century anymore. And I think that that's a really hard jump for a lot of people. And those of us who grew up with our special pens and our special pencils and our paper books, it's a big leap for us to think about how these kids are thinking differently and to remind ourselves that we're not actually punishing them and we're not taking away from them by teaching them some of these other skills. And the point that you actually also just made about making it available to everybody, absolutely. I feel very strong about, you know, what's necessary for some is good for most and should be available to all. So again, there's other kids who don't have a disability in writing, but they might just be better at typing and they might think
Sure.
freely. Um, People our generation don't. I was a weird kid because I thought better typing than I did writing, but I was very
Yeah.
much different. Whereas now a lot of the kids do feel better being able to use speech to text or type. So those are things I think definitely to keep in mind. And when we want to think about what skills we need to develop, we really want to look at 21st century skills.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Right, I am going to turn the recording off in case anybody has questions.